Most of us know that this book emerges out of a lifetime of activism fighting violence against women, along with Nadia's racism, anti-Semitism, in more recent decades, Islamophobia and other isms. And both her heartfulness and her fierceness comes out in the book and in her work. I can't remember what years it was, probably the 90s. I took Nadia's SDIO class, Self-Defense from the Inside Out. Maybe many of you did too. And I remember being in those classes and like shouting "no" at the top of our lungs, and the different exercises, physical and mental and verbal, that Nadia led us through. I remember doing the exercises in your workbook, all the versions of the workbook that you worked on, that formed the template for this book that we now have in our hands. And thousands of women in those classes were influenced and found their power in their voice, and now the book is going to go ahead and reach thousands of more people, which is really thrilling. So I'm happy to introduce you, Nadia, and we're all really happy to be here.
Thank you, Ellen. I have some thanks to start. Thanks for all of you for wearing masks so I can speak without one. I really appreciate that a lot. I want to thank Scott and Tsunami for this opportunity. And I want to thank the many people in this audience who have been my crew. Many of you know that I have been ill, and they have been my crew in supporting me and in making this event happen, and it couldn't happen without you. And finally, I want to thank my co-author, Lauren Taylor. And how that came about was that I had this workbook that I used with my students in the 80s and 90s and aughts, and I got it published through Kinko's because I just didn't have the interest or the ability to know how to get it published in any other way. And so I kind of let it go. And then 10 years ago or so, I was in the DC area, and that's where a self-defense colleague lives, and she is also a writer. And I asked her if she'd be willing to work with me on actually getting the book published and updated. And so she agreed, and that's why you see the book now. So I want to start by asking you some questions, and it's going to be interesting because this is a fairly small group. And the only rule for this exercise is you don't have to do it if you don't want to. So I'm going to ask some questions, and if you can relate, put your hand up. So if you have ever been harassed on the street, put your hand up. And then just look around. Put your hands up. Okay. If you have ever been expected to move, this is especially for women, if you've ever been expected to move when a man is approaching you on the sidewalk or anywhere. Okay. If you've ever encountered somebody exposing themselves. And look at this. Look around the room. If you've ever had someone in authority, a teacher, a boss, an adult, a religious person, behave inappropriately towards you. And look at the hands again. If you've ever been afraid to take a walk alone. And if you've ever been afraid to do something that you wanted to do, like camping or traveling, something like that, and you didn't because of fear of violence. So I think just looking at how frequently these things happen, it's clear evidence that this is not about particular assailants, but it's about a whole system. And It's about a system that it's not all violent violence. There's a spectrum of things that are just irritating, like being expected to move, all the way to life-threatening. But what all those things have in common is they express power and they maintain power. They all take our space, whether it's just touching us, whether it's shrinking where we go, where we live, what we do. So it takes away our space. These things on this spectrum are committed by strangers, acquaintances, and people with power. We've been sold a bill of goods around gender-based violence that it's strangers. And in fact, that's a small proportion of those who... Thank you so much. If you add in all parts of somebody's identity, you have something called intersectionality, which means that in addition to women being targeted and LGBTQIA people being targeted, if you are homeless, if you are of a marginalized racial identity, disability, class identity, immigration status, etc., then that damage along that spectrum is even worse. So this spectrum is designed to control us and keep people in power. The other part of this is that the blame is put on those who are targeted. This keeps the system in place. And so we have a double standard, for example. And a really, I think, a telling example of this is if you think about alcohol and rape. If there is somebody who was raped and that person, usually a woman, was drunk at the time of the rape, is she held more or less accountable? Usually more accountable, right? And if there's a rape and the rapist was drunk at the time of the rape, are they held more or less accountable? Less accountable. So we have a real double standard here. This is so pervasive that we often don't even notice it. So for example, if you hear about a rape on the bike path when a woman was jogging alone at night, the first thing people usually focus on is what was she doing there? And that keeps the focus off the perpetrator. And if a woman went to a man's house and had some drinks with him and got assaulted, the focus is usually on what was wrong with her, how could she have done that, it was her fault. And it keeps the focus off the perpetrator. As long as we keep the focus off the perpetrators, there can be no change to either the perpetrators or the whole system. This blame is so pervasive and so deep and so harmful, it's really heartbreaking. And that's what a lot of this book is about addressing. So I invite you to take a breath after all of that. And also to remember a few important points. If something has happened to you anywhere along the spectrum, it is not your fault. The fault rests 100% with the person who perpetrated the acts, 100%. Whatever you did was the right thing to do, because we always do the best we can. We always do the best we can. When I mentioned intersectionality, I also want to say that this range of acts of violence pertain to lots of different identities. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of this around the LGBTQIA community, and in fact, next Monday is the Trans Day of Remembrance, remembering all the trans people, especially trans women, who have been murdered, to keep people in their place. We certainly see this with racism. And probably the only exception to the fact that perpetrators aren't held accountable. Perpetrators are held accountable when it's in the interests of those in power to either hold them accountable or to claim they are accountable. And so for this reason, we know that there's a history of rape and racism in this country, and blaming black men for rape was a way to control the black population. It wasn't about really for the support of women. It was support of women as possessions of certain men. So the book is about the systemic nature of the violence and about what gender-based violence is as a whole construct, but it's also about many more details. So we cover things in the book like stages of assault. How do assaults work? What are the ploys that assailants use? What are the things that we can do in order to respond to the violence and survive the violence? But it's not good enough to know what to do. So you could read one of these chapters and I could give you a quiz and you could get 100% on the quiz. These are the ploys, this is what to do. But it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to do it. And so this is where the pain and the shame and the self-blame come in. We might know what to do and not be able to do it. So I want to tell you a story, and some of you have heard this story. It's really the basis of the book for me. It was why I wrote the book, because I needed it. So this was the story. I was living in New York City quite a while ago, and I went into an Army-Navy store to buy a pair of pants. In the book, we call it a thrift store, but it's the same story. And while I was there, an employee came to the area where I was changing. They didn't have a dressing room. They just had an area where they stored clothes and you could go back there. And so while I was there, this guy came into the area where I was. He got it on a ladder looking for some clothes with his back to me. And I didn't say anything because I was taught to be polite and to be kind and to be nice and not to disrupt somebody else's day. He got down off the ladder and he asked me how the pants fit, and I said, not quite right. So he took a tape measure from around his neck and he put it around my waist. I was not very comfortable with this, but maybe he was trying to get me a good pair of pants because they come in waist sizes. So then he put the tape measure around my thigh, and every step I kept saying, if he does something, I am going to say something. And then I would move the line back. So he put the tape measure around my thigh, and I still couldn't say anything, but there was a battle going on inside my head. Like, get your mouth open. But what if I'm wrong? I didn't say anything. So he undid my pants. He started to put the tape measure around my naked thigh. And at this point, I said something incredibly assertive, like, I think you better go now. And he left. There's a postscript to the story that I'll tell you later. So this was an incredibly painful experience for me. I walked out of that store, not angry at him, but angry at myself. How could I be so stupid and so pathetic that I would just stand there? I'm the only one in the whole world who would be this stupid. So if you can relate, and let me know I wasn't the only one, put your hands up. Right. So in order to deal with this, I needed to understand what happened. I started to dissect my behavior to understand it. And this is the way it's written in the book, to give you a flavor of the book. It's written in third person about my story. Nadia went into a thrift store to buy a pair of jeans. There was no dressing room, just an aisle in the back where boxes were stacked. While she was changing, an employee entered the area, and with his back to her, he began sorting through the boxes. Nadia was uncomfortable, her feeling, but she didn't say anything because he was just doing his job. Making excuses for his behavior, denial. So I should back up a little bit. What I came up with to explain what happened was what I call the internal barriers. They are denial, that anything's going on, or that it's that bad, or that it really bothers us, passivity, self-blame, and feelings of low self-worth. And that's what you'll see reflected here. I didn't say anything. I'm just going to change it into me. I just didn't say anything because he was just doing his job, making excuses for his behavior, denial. And I didn't want to seem paranoid. I was worried about what he would think of me. He then turned around and asked me how the jeans fit. I dismissed my discomfort. I ignored my feelings and answered him. He then put a tape measure around my waist, convincing talking myself out of my feelings that he was trying to, that I think I'll have to go back to the third person, sorry. Talking herself out of her feelings that he was trying to help her. After all, jeans come in waist sizes. She said nothing, but resolved to speak out if he did anything, reacting instead of acting. So I asked myself, well, if he does this, then I will do this. Instead of what do I want to do? I was waiting just to react to him. He then put the tape measure around her thigh. Again, she didn't say anything, telling herself that he was just trying to get her the best fit. Finally, he pulled down the jeans and measured her naked thigh. At that point, she was out of excuses for him and out of denial. She was sure something was wrong and told him to leave, set a limit. He did. She felt that the whole assault was her fault, self-blame, for continuing to give him the benefit of the doubt, prioritizing his feelings. She didn't tell anyone what happened for a long time because she was sure that no one else would be as stupid, negative self-talk, self-blame as she was. So the next step was, how do I change these pieces? So how do I change denial? The first thing was to embrace intuition. I knew from the second he came into that area that this was not right. So learning to listen to our intuition. I didn't know what the ploys were that assailants use. One of the most common ploys is offering help. Either asking for help or offering help, which is what he did. I also didn't understand the stages of assault, one of which is approaching somebody and testing them. And the test is by incrementally breaking a boundary. He didn't just come back where I was and take my pants down. He came back where I was. Step 1. I didn't say anything. Step 2. He went a little more, incrementally. At any moment that I had stopped it earlier, he likely would have put the blame on me. Boy, are you a bitch. What is your problem? I'm just trying to help you. Which, if we don't feel centered in ourselves, can be very, very difficult to hear and very devastating. In terms of passivity, I was very stuck in what I would tolerate, not what I wanted. And in order to change passivity, I needed to take action, and I really didn't know how to do that. I didn't know assertiveness. I didn't have any idea what to say or how to say it. I needed to change self-blame, and one way to do that was to allow myself to feel angry. It is appropriate to feel angry at intrusions on our lives and our bodies. It is entirely appropriate, although it is not allowed to women. And then if you add in that intersectionality, so you have women of color, it is even less allowed to be angry. I needed to hold this person accountable instead of focusing on myself. And I also needed to realize that there's a difference between self-blame and regret. So I regretted that I was quiet. That didn't make me at fault for the assault. So dividing those two. And finally, feelings of low self-worth. I was really worried about his needs, interrupting his workday, hurting his feelings. I didn't ask myself, does he care about mine? Is he thinking for 1 second or caring for 1 second about the fact that I might be uncomfortable? And obviously he wasn't. So this is something that we have in the book about low self-worth. To be able to defend, stick up for, and advocate for ourselves, it's important to believe it's okay to claim my power. It's okay to believe in and trust myself, even when I have doubts. It's okay to put myself first. I can allow myself the same empathy, compassion, and grace that I give others. My life and safety are precious, and I deserve to be safe. I am valuable, and I am worth defending. I didn't know any of that. So I want to do a little audience participation again. Claiming our power starts with the word no. And no is sometimes seen as negative, but every no is a doorway to a yes. And women in particular are not supposed to say no. So we're going to practice. And we're going to practice with unadorned no's, which what I mean is I'm going to ask you a question and I want you to just answer no, even if you want to say no and give an explanation, or no and kind of soften it. Just for now, just practice the words no. Can I borrow your pen?
No.
Let me give you a ride.
No.
Can I touch your hair?
No.
Can I make a reservation in a restaurant with stairs just this once? I promise I'll help you.
No.
Good. Come on, just one drink.
No.
So then what usually happens is the person starts insisting, oh, come on. What? Just come on. What is your problem?
No.
Just one drink.
No.
And if it keeps going, then you can turn it around and hold them accountable. I have now said no and made it clear. Tell me why you're having a hard time listening to that. So put the spotlight on them. So now a few more phrases that I want you to say after me. I'm not comfortable with you here. You need to wait.
I'm not comfortable with you here. You need to wait.
And let's try that one more time. I'm not comfortable with you here. You need to wait. I don't want your help.
I don't want your help.
Don't touch me.
Don't touch me.
You need to leave now.
You need to leave now.
And notice it's not just the words, but it has to be your eye contact and your body language so that you're taking up space when you say these things. So I want you to apply this to my story and help me out. So I go into the store and I go into an area and this guy who works in the store comes back where I am. So the first phrase, if you can remember it. I'm not comfortable with you here. You need to wait. Okay, and your turn.
I'm not comfortable with you here. You need to wait.
And if I didn't say anything and didn't stop it then, and he takes the tape measure and he starts to put it around my waist, one thing that I could have said is, I don't want your help.
I don't want your help.
And if I still didn't say anything and he started to put it around my thigh, I might say, don't touch me, you need to leave now.
Don't touch me, you need to leave now.
So these are some things I might have said, except I didn't understand assertiveness. So a little bit about assertiveness. Assertiveness is saying what you feel, need, or want directly, clearly, and respectfully, without hinting, apologizing, expecting someone to read your mind, or being passive-aggressive. Being assertive also means no name-calling, no put-downs, and no cursing. By being assertive, we take responsibility for our feelings, and we don't guess someone else's motives. And I think this is where we get stuck a lot. We get stuck in, what do they mean by this? Do they mean something bad by this or not? And if we just start with ourselves and what we're feeling and needing, it doesn't matter what their motives are. And so that allows us to say something. Assertive means respecting our own rights and the rights of the other person. And there's a whole lot of tips about how to be assertive and that are in the book, so I'm not going to go through them now, but they're in here. I needed to heal from this experience, and to a lot of people it might not seem like a big experience. It wasn't a horrible act of violence, but it was pretty significant to me and pretty damaging to me. It's very hard to heal by ourselves. You generally need to have others help you heal, others who aren't going to say the wrong thing to you. So what was going on for me then is this was in the 70s, and I was part of a consciousness raising group. And for anybody here who doesn't know what they were when women got together and we shared our experiences and started unpeeling how sexism was affecting our lives. And I wanted to tell my group, but I thought, oh my gosh, what if this group says to me, how could you just stand there? Because remember, I thought I was the only one. And then finally I decided to screw up my courage and break silence and tell my group. I was terrified. And what ended up happening, and you could tell from the responses today, were that people in my group could totally relate and started sharing their own stories with me. A couple of women decided to go with me back to the store. For one thing, I got a pair of pants that didn't even fit right. I just wanted to get out of there. So I really wanted pants that fit. So some friends said that they would go with me. And when we walked into the store, the manager or owner was there and the employee was there. It was close to closing. They clearly could feel our energy and tried to tell us the store was closed. And we pointed out that it wasn't, according to their sign. And I went to try on a pair of pants that would fit. And meanwhile, my friends got into it. They confronted the guy, the employee, about what he had done. And he, of course, said, I did not, blah, 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 blah. And then one of my friends called him a pig in a language that they shared. At which point, he punched her, broke her glasses, and bloodied her nose. She was actually very proud of it. Because in fighting for me, she was fighting for herself as well. She probably bronzed the glasses. The manager or the owner at that point said, well, you all came in and started it. And we said, if that's the way you see this, fine, we'll be back with a picket line. And so we started organizing that, but when we went back, the guy had been fired. So you don't always get this, but it was wonderful when sometimes you can go back when something has happened. Maybe it's just somebody saying something very inappropriate to you. Going back later on your terms when you are setting the time, you're the one more in control, can be a great way to heal from even just something fairly minor. If somebody said something to you that was hurtful or completely inappropriate, sometimes you get to do something like we got to do. But I also want to point out that my friends did not use assertiveness. And you can see where aggression gets you. Not only is it, we don't want to make a world where we're adding aggression. We want to make a world where we can set a limit and call behavior out, but we don't want to add violence. And obviously it escalated things. So finally, I would like, before I take questions, I would like to end with a yes. Since a no is an opening to a yes, I'm going to invite you, if you have other things to call out that we can say yes to go ahead and do that. So just answer with a yes like you believe it. We all deserve to have our boundaries respected.
Yes.
We have a right to speak up for what we need.
Yes.
It's really quiet. Say it like you believe it.
Yes.
Yes.
We have a right to take up space in the world.
Yes.
We deserve to live free from the reality and threat of violence.
Yes.
And anything else? Okay, that's fine. And I would love to take some questions now, if anybody has any. Yes.
I'd be interested in knowing where you went from there because this has been a life's work, and you just gave us, two key moments early on. But I just want to know where you went from there in your work along these lines.
Okay. First of all, I just want to say personally, once I figured out these pieces, things did not just change. So, it's an ongoing work. But all the times that I fall short, I remind myself it's not my fault. I'm doing the best I can. So that's one thing. In terms of the work, most of you know that I went on to teach self-defense, and the kind of self-defense that I developed is called empowerment self-defense, and I can explain that in a minute. So that's the main thing that I did was really develop the concept for empowerment self-defense, along with colleagues in what was the martial arts world then taking on self-defense. And I have to mention Jocelyn in the pink mask over there, who's been very important in promoting empowerment self-defense and researching it. Because we were told in the beginning, all you're going to do is make things worse and get somebody angry and get hurt. And some of us didn't believe that. And sure enough, research was done that proved that we were right. That the fact that there's no guarantees still, your chances when you are assertive and you speak up and you fight back are much better, and the healing is much quicker. So empowerment self-defense is, when I started teaching self-defense, it was basically karate. And when people hear that I teach self-defense, they often ask me, well, what style do you do? As if it's a martial arts. So traditional self-defense is focused on stranger assault. It's focused on physical assault. And it's all about physical skills. Often it's fear-based. And so there's a lot of damage done in some self-defense classes. Empowerment self-defense is all about recognizing that we have options, but that no one has the right to tell us which options we should have or should take. Every assailant is different. Every one of us is different. No one has the right to judge. It has to do with holding perpetrators accountable. It has to do with a range of assaults. And it has to do with stopping assaults, not just when they're physical, but way before that, at the earliest stages of assault. But more than all of this, empowerment self-defense is about changing us from the inside, all the ways that the patriarchy, because that's what this is about, have gotten into our heads and controlled us and limited us. And Jocelyn recently did some research about other benefits to self-defense that have nothing to do with self-defense. Has nothing to do with an assault happening, nothing to do with fear of assault, just about how it changes us from the inside out and changes our whole way that we approach the world. And I certainly have heard from many students about how their whole world is different. And you wouldn't get that from a traditional self-defense class. And finally, another part of empowerment self-defense that's really important is bringing people together so that we're not dealing with this in isolation, but that we're building community. Because that's an essential part of changing the culture and changing our own sense of well-being. So, other questions?
Could you give an example of that?
Of
How non-aggression self-defense works?
how non-aggressive?
Well, yeah, assertive rather than aggressive.
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, you were saying that your friends were aggressive.
Right.
They had a bad outcome. So I'm assuming that means that being assertive can have a good outcome. Could you give an example?
Sure. They might have gone into the store and said, "We're here because our friend here got really badly treated by your employee. And that's not okay. And we want to know what you're going to do about it." Very different than calling him a pig. Or putting a finger in somebody's face. So part of all of this is also about de-escalation. That we don't want to be escalating the violence. Yeah.
I wish I'd known a lot of this when I was younger, and I'm just wondering if you know of any local programs or national programs where this needs to be taught in schools.
You know, I don't know about being taught in schools. Could everybody hear the question? What I do know is that this is a movement now, and it's international now. People teaching out of this model. There's been incredible work done for example, in Nairobi, Kenya. And there's been work done not only with the girls, but with the boys, teaching them about what they need to do and how they need to behave. And it is really, there's been research on the success of that program in cutting down the number of assaults. So I agree, it needs to be everywhere. And this is probably a good place for me to talk about men and boys. So first off, we know that men are victimized too, especially as boys. The book is not written specifically for them because patriarchy really has to do with women and how women are oppressed and LGBTQIA people are oppressed. But that is not to say that men and boys don't go through things. It's also not to say that women can't be perpetrators, because they can. We're often asked, as a criticism of self-defense, why should we have to do this? We're not the ones that create the problem. And I could not agree more, and neither could Lauren. However, as long as we're living with this and things are not changing, I don't want to just sit there and wait for someone to change. I need to have some tools to deal with it. And one of the things that is disheartening to me is how few men are stepping up. Just as with racism, a huge part of dealing with racism is white people understanding it and taking actions and changing the way we are in the world. The same thing is true of the rape culture. there are lots of pieces of the rape culture are not done intentionally. They're done because it's part of the culture. So for the smallest example of being expected to move, and we certainly see this with white and black people too, who's expected to move, it tells you who has the power. It's not like the people who are expecting that they have the right of way think about, hey, I have the power. They just have the power because it's part of the culture. And it's the same thing with who touches who. Women are often touched in a way that's not necessarily sexual and not necessarily aggressive. It could just be a pat on the head, an arm around the shoulder, in situations where the reverse would never happen. And that tells you who has the power. So if you had two men, and one is the employer and one is the employee, one of them is much more likely to have his arm around the other one's shoulder. It becomes an unconscious reassertion of who has the power. I did want to mention around the issue of men. There is a longtime activist, Jackson Katz, and he has a wonderful video called The Bystander Moment, Transforming Rape Culture, in which he is talking to men and the responsibility of men to address this. And this is just an experience in my life right now. A lot of my high school classmates got on Facebook when we were having a reunion. And one of the guys in my class posts every day, Redhead of the Day, which is a young woman, buxom, half nude. And then all these 75-year-old men chime in about rating her. It's pretty pathetic, as that's their way of asserting their masculinity. And then it moves up that spectrum a little past just rating body parts to one of them said, I would do her even if she had sand in her cooch. So that moved up a little more. Some of them were responding, oh, she's too young, I don't want to go to jail. They don't care about her. They just care about whether they would go to jail. And I have been, as you could imagine, pretty disgusted and upset by this whole thing. But what I'm most upset about is the silence of the rest of the men. Not a one has spoken up to say, this is not okay. And until that happens, we are stuck with the rape culture and everything that it involves. So any other questions? Yeah.
I know this is a little bit connected with what you were just talking about, but I wonder how you see the connection between empowerment, self-defense, and the upstander bystander trainings you've been involved with and helped set up over the last few years. And the reason I ask that question is because I took one of those trainings with you 4 or 5 years ago, and I see more and more how it has affected how I can be in the world and the choices that I can make very, very differently than I would have without that training. So I'm wondering if you see a connection between those two.
No, totally. So for those of you who don't know, we did some bystander trainings, and there's some still going on, about what do you do when you see harassment based on, any number of things. It could be disability, it could be race, it could be class, it could be, again, immigration status, it could be so many different things. And what often happens is silence, the same silence I was just talking about on the part of men. And that silence comes across as approval for that behavior. And the person who's being harassed, when they're met with that silence, it's devastating to feel like you're all alone and nobody supports you and nobody thinks that you shouldn't have undergone this. And knowing all of this, there are trainings about how do you interrupt something, because it isn't natural and we have so much telling us not to do it or how not to do it. And so there are trainings and there's practice. And that's what men need too, is exactly the same thing. Practicing scenarios of, okay, somebody said this thing or patted this woman in front of you or whatever it is. How do you speak up? We know that men talk about women in front of other men all the time, and we know that some of the men are very uncomfortable with that. And so practice would be really helpful. Does that answer what you're asking, Pat?
Yeah, I was just wondering
Yeah.
how you saw that connection.
Nadia, thank you for this talk. I've been watching you talk about this stuff for many years now, and I'm always amazed by how you can just cut to it's so incisive and so articulate, and you cut to the heart of it all the time. So it's always a treat to get to watch you speak. I was wondering if you could say more about intersectionality and how it plays into empowerment, self-defense, and probably the bystander upstander training as well. In my experience, it's been part of this movement even before there was the word intersectionality. So I'm curious about your perspective on the role it plays.
So intersectionality refers to the fact that different parts of our identity intersect, and you can't just separate one piece out. So if you are a lesbian woman who's disabled, you can't separate out a piece of that. And so because the spectrum of violence or the spectrums of violence apply to keeping power in place for any particular group that is marginalized, you can have a spectrum for different groups. So for example, there's violence that keeps racism in place. Lynching was a great example. And also now just thinking about traffic stops of black drivers, especially black men drivers. It curtails their space. It makes them have to behave in certain ways. It takes away freedom. Certainly gay bashing is another example of you get back in your place. You may not be outside the norm. And then if you have something that happens to somebody and they have multiple identities, you can't always separate out which are the parts that are being targeted. What we do know is one of the stages of assault is someone selecting someone to victimize. And they do that based on a bunch of different factors. One of the factors is your identity. And so, are you someone who has a disability? Are you an immigrant? Are you a person of color? You're likely to be more vulnerable in certain ways and less likely to be supported and believed, and less likely to have access to a criminal justice system. We also know that people are selected based on the roles they're playing. It might be a student versus a teacher, or an athlete versus a coach, an immigrant versus somebody who has power over their status. And this also leads into vulnerability. Somebody's role might be as a housekeeper, a domestic worker, a sex worker. These folks are at incredible risk of violence because of the access that people have to them, the fact that they're not supported in general by society a lot of the times, and the fact that they have no power to fight back. So that's another aspect of this. And finally, somebody who really can't speak up because they don't know the language. Maybe they don't understand what happened or have the ability to speak up because of a mental disability. So those are some examples of being a very safe victim for somebody who's targeting somebody. Yeah.
Are you okay with hearing a testimonial?
Sure.
So, in the 1980s, hi Andy, hi Sue. I was volunteering at the women's crisis service, and as part of that, they said, well, all our volunteers have to
idea that that there's a name for these subtle behaviors that encroach slowly on your space. That it's not, you're either safe or you're under assault. It was all this spectrum of stuff, and it was eye-opening to me. And in my mind, what happened next all happened in the same day, but it might be, that it took a few days. So I left that training, probably all morning, and I went to, lived in Salem, so I went to this place where people were kind of picnicking and hanging out. And I laid out my blanket and, sitting down, whatever I'm going to be sitting there, listen to music or something like this. And there's oodles of space all around me. And this guy comes up with his bike, and instead of being anywhere else, he parks it 2 feet from me and sits right down there. And newly empowered, I'm Nadia, I just went, I know exactly what you're doing. Move your bike. Get away from my space. There's all kinds, at that loud, I was that loud with him because, whoa! And, just to top it off, sometime later, I went to the laundromat, and the exact same thing happens. Empty laundromat, my stuff is in there, some guy comes in, sits down 1 chair over from me, and he got the same thing. I know exactly what you're doing.
Yay!
And
Bravo! Yeah.
that was 40 years ago, and it was life-changing. It was like having a name for what we now kind of call gaslighting. Was just like, oh my God, I'm seeing these things, and it's a real thing, and that was just miraculous. So, thank you, Nadia, and thank you for not doing the karate stuff. This was so much more valuable.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Which is fun, by the way, but it's not the crux of this. And it is good to have those skills too, but yes. And I know it's wonderful that you took that workshop and you were able to do that. That's not always the case, and I think we just need to really take that in. That this training that we get in being kind and nice and passive comes from gender role, comes along with all the pieces of intersectionality. It comes from the whole culture, and so every time we can break free of that is really something to celebrate. So that is just totally great. I'm so glad to hear that.
And I just want to say that, the me of that time was all of those things. Passive, afraid of offending, everything else. And I remained that same person. But just having those little moments where it's like, I didn't do that.
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So any other questions? Thank you so much for coming and for helping me celebrate this book. So I appreciate it a lot. If you know anybody who might need it as a holiday gift, keep that in mind. So thanks, and I'm happy to sign any copies if you have them.